Good morning. Thank you for coming in this morning. We appreciate it. We're here today to address some misinformation and misunderstandings that the public may have on this incident. The attorneys who are representing the officers will each speak and also show some relevant video information as well. We ask you please hold your questions to the completion of their presentations, at which time there'll be an opportunity to address any of your individual questions as well. Media kits are going to be provided at the end, which will contain a flash drive and some documents and relative information. As I said, thank you, and turn it over.
Folks, good morning. Again, my name is, whoops, here we go. Whose microphone was that already? All right. Folks, again, good morning. My name is Michael Sciano. I represent Officer Santiago. Up here at the podium with me, Mr. Rich, who represents 4 of the officers who are currently suspended, Mr. Nobles, who represents Officer Vaughn, Mr. Mistrella represents Officer Talladay. The purpose of this press conference, folks, is to answer some of the questions that have been out there and misleading information that's been in the press since the beginning of this case. Again, there's only been one view of these events that has been put out. It's our purpose here today is to try to share some information that has been out there and presented, and again, show some of the training videos that we have prepared for you folks. We have a zip drive. That zip drive is going to contain a number of different articles, including videos, manuals, body-worn camera of officers of Clarence Specs Corps that deal with this investigation that happened on March 22nd and March 23rd of 2020. As you're all aware, these officers are currently suspended with pay. And there's been allegations, again, made of these officers for lack of sympathy, lack of training. And again, the purpose of this is to try to show you folks what exactly happened that night and why these officers acted the way they did. Collectively, we are extremely remorseful and sorry to the Prude family for the loss of their loved one. But unfortunately, folks, in this case, these officers are being mistreated, we believe, unfairly. Their lives have been threatened. There's been bounties placed on their heads. Their neighborhoods have been protesters have been there almost on a daily basis. And it's our purpose here today to try to show you folks exactly what they've been doing, how they've been trained, what exactly happened on those events of March 22nd and 23rd of 2020. Folks, we have given another pamphlet. You'll have a pamphlet that shows these officers' training, the number of years on their service, any awards they've received, throughout their course, their years on service. My officer has been on the service for approximately 14 and a half years. Again, those packages will be distributed on zip drives that you'll have. Folks, one of the issues that has come up in viewing the video is that these officers have been accused of not treating Mr. Prude humanely. You've seen videos of these officers standing around, and there's been allegations of why didn't they put a blanket on this individual. These officers, and what's critical to know in this case is what did these officers know on March 22nd and March 23rd of 2020? What was aware? What you folks don't know as a public is what these officers heard over the 911 airwaves that day. They were told that this person was under the influence of PCP. You're going to hear from a number of different, you'll see the video of Officer Specs Corps. His video depicts a conversation with Mr. Prude, who told these officers that night. And again, the timeline is going to show, folks, that there's a phone call comes in on 3 o'clock on the 23rd. But before I get to that, there was phone calls that happened on the 22nd of March. On the 22nd of March, you're going to hear that Valerie Prude calls and says that a relative of hers is hallucinating on drugs. That's about 6:53. Mr. Prude's taken into custody by the police and brought to Strong Memorial Hospital. He's released at 11 o'clock that night. 4 hours later, there's a phone call from that same address on Child Street. The officers respond. Officer Specs Corps responds and talks to the individuals there, Joseph Prude. At that time, Mr. Prude tells him that his brother is on PCP. He's not there, he's running around. You're going to hear the body-worn camera of Officer Specs Corps where he tells you, he hears a conversation that comes over the 911 airwaves that says, hey, there's a break-in at West Main Street at 3:04. At 3:09, you're going to hear a tow truck driver calling in an alarm saying there's a man running naked in the street covered in blood. Joseph Prude tells Officer Specksquire that that must be my brother. Folks, it's very important to know that because at this point, all the officers on scene that are responding to this area looking for Mr. Prude are looking for this person. They're looking for someone on PCP. And again, you're going to hear that someone on PCP, and there was one of the things that was talked about was that the officers didn't put a blanket on him. Well, you're going to hear that he was hyperthermic, that he was overheated. And by putting a blanket on someone would have exacerbated the situation. They didn't do that. They acted appropriately based upon their training. So again, at 3:09, you hear this break-in, you hear the tow truck driver calling, saying that there's some type of man running naked down the street, covered in blood. The officers then respond to the area. At about 3:16, a number of officers on scene, but they make some observations. And again, Mr. Rich is going to talk about PCP and what happens with someone that's under the influence of PCP, but they make observations of a person defecating in the street and chewing on a garbage can. They see him almost hit by a vehicle. At that point, these officers are surrounding this individual, and you've all seen the video at that point, where the officers are surrounding the individual on the street, and they're about 6 feet away. Now keep in mind, this is in March of 2020, the height of the COVID-19. At that point, these officers do not have any personal protection devices. You'll see the video, some don't even have masks on. They're staying away from this individual because of a couple of reasons. One, he's on PCP. They're trying to ascertain what to do. They have put a perimeter around him at this point. At that point, you're going to hear and see that there are a number of gestures and comments made by Mr. Prude that requires a spit sock being put on this individual. That's at 3:19. But at 3:17, 1 minute after these officers arrive on the scene, what do? They call EMS, because that's what's required. They call EMS, and they are on their way. The ambulance arrives within 4 minutes at 3:21. The total period of time that these officers are even with Mr. Prude is from 3:16 to when he's put on an ambulance at 3:27. That's critically important, because at some point during that 11 minutes you're going to see, and you've seen on the video, what actually happens. These officers are trained specifically when dealing with someone that's under the influence of PCP where they cannot control them. They're not going to take out a baton. They're not going to hit this person. They're taught to segment and put this person for his own safety. Because as you've seen, he was running around the streets of Rochester naked, could have got hit by a car, could have caused an accident, could have done anything. But at that point, the officers did what they were trained to do. And I'm going to ask Officer DeFingenis to please play for a second part of the video that you folks are all going to have to show later on. This is a training video that every single RPD officer has done and passed with proficiency. And again, if you can play it for me, Mr. Adam.
All right, so I'm going to show you the segmenting, which is a secondary option from the high-low to the low anchor and the knee on top going to lateral head switch. This is going to be for the situations where you don't want to anchor in a boss guy and take him out of the fight, just anchor him down. Maybe we don't have a third guy to watch our backs, or maybe it's a hostile area. Maybe it's the environment is all glass here, and we don't want him hugged in around the legs and getting all cut up. So we'll go to what we call segmenting, and one guy's going to go knee on top, controlling the tips. The other guy's going to go on the head. I kind of just take my hands like a webbing, and I put my hand right around his ear and his head. I'm going to beat in like a teepee, so all my weight's going to be on his head. And if he's trying to push up, I'm just pinning his head to the ground here. Okay? My job is going to be to watch his hand or watch, the crowd, any of the unfriendlies. While Kirk's job is going to be to stay knee on top, controlling his hips, watch his hands. If he starts to do a push-up, he can control his wrist, right? And he can still watch this way now. So if we need to watch separate ways, we can watch separate ways. If we need to disengage fast, disengage, we can both disengage and be together. So one more time. So one officer will go to the hips off of the takedown and segmenting, or the segmenting his body. This officer is going to control his hips with the knee on top. He's watching his arms, okay, and his hands. He can also now watch the area around him. Second officer is going to the head, controlling his head. Once again, we're utilizing our control points, the hips and the head. And at this point, I can watch his hands, I can watch Kirk's back, and Kirk can control the arms if he tries to do a push-up, I go into the wrist ride. And if Kirk and I need to disengage because it starts too many unfriendly is going to start to attack us, disengage and come together.
Thank you. Again, folks, keep in mind, again, what did the officers know and what was happening at those early morning hours on March 23rd? You heard that, and again, the officers would have told and made statements that this individual was reaching for the gun, wanted the gun to shoot himself, making all kinds of comments that he wanted to kill himself with their weapon. They had to do two things: protect Mr. Prude, make sure that he was safe. Ambulance was on his way. Ambulance was there within 4 minutes of this all occurring. Again, the spit sock was utilized because, again, he's screaming and yelling that he has coronavirus, he has feces on himself, he's covered with blood. These officers had to protect themselves also, and that's what happened that day. The spit sock is utilized, and Mr. Nobles will talk about that in a few moments, but it was utilized to protect the officers from what was happening that day. Just keep in mind, in terms of time period here, that procedure that was done, that these officers were proficient on, was done for approximately 2 minutes only. The whole period of time these officers were with this individual, Mr. Prude, was 11 minutes. 11 minutes before he was taken away on an ambulance. Folks, again, the whole purpose of being here and explaining to you folks what our position is and what the officers' training was to explain exactly what happened that day from the officers' point of view. Again, my colleagues will also have a chance to talk to you, and if you have any questions, we can ask them afterwards. Thank you. Mr. Rich.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Mike. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. I do have to mention that I am representing 4 of the officers involved here who have all been suspended. Officer Ricotta, Officer Speckscore, Officer Harris, and Sergeant Magri. I do have to mention that as pertains to Officers Ricotta and Speckscore, at the time the defensive tactic was applied to Mr. Prude, Officer Ricotta was not even at the scene on Jefferson Avenue. Instead, he was still at the scene of the break-in that Mr. Prude participated in at 767 West Main. So he wasn't even there. Officer Speckscore was on the scene at Jefferson Avenue. However, at the time the defensive tactic was applied, he was in his patrol car and could not see what was happening. Both of these officers have been unjustly suspended, and we demand their immediate reinstatement to duty. Now, Mike mentioned that the events of March 23rd and March 22nd had a lot to do with Mr. Prude's voluntary ingestion of PCP, which led to his acute intoxication. His death, while tragic, was the result of that acute involuntary intoxication and not the result of anything the officers did or did not do. The ingestion of PCP and its effects were the root cause of Mr. Prude's irrational and dangerous statements and behavior that you have seen previously and that you will see in the materials we're providing you. Many in the media and elsewhere have cast this incident as a mental health event. It was not. It was an event that involved the use of a dangerous drug with very serious side effects. The main goal of the officers on the scene was to secure Mr. Prude and to get him medical help. His voluntary use of PCP ultimately made that impossible. From what we've been able to learn about PCP in the time we've been involved in this case, PCP, even at low dosages, leads to irrational and aggressive behavior. It leads to excited delirium, paranoid delusions, a loss of balance, a diminished ability to feel pain, heightened levels of strength, lack of impulse control, a heightened metabolism, respiratory impairment, overheating, vomiting, and other dangerous side effects. On the evening of March 22nd and 23rd, Mr. Prude posed a danger to himself, others, and to the first responders that he came in contact with. What we've come to learn is that when you're a first responder dealing with someone who's high on PCP, the only safe option is to try to restrain them for the safety of all concerned. Now, we are certainly planning to carefully review the medical examiner's findings as well as the details of Mr. Prude's stay at Strong Hospital during the evening of March 22nd. However, in looking at the limited medical documentation we have in our possession at this point, the following things are clear. When Mr. Prude was discharged from Strong at around 10:50 p.m. on March 22nd, he was not acutely intoxicated by PCP, nor was he having a mental health crisis at that point. The toxicology report that came out of his second stay at Strong shows a significant amount of PCP in his system when his blood was drawn shortly after 4 a.m. on the 23rd. Thus, it stands to reason that Mr. Prude used PCP between the time of his discharge on the 22nd and when he left his brother's house around 3 a.m. on the 23rd. It should be noted that the medical examiner's report, or at least the portion that we're in possession of at this time, records no observations of Mr. Prude's neck, mouth, nose, windpipe, or lungs, which would tend to indicate that he suffocated or was choked by the officers. The ME's statement about the cause of Mr. Prude's death is a statement of medical opinion. It is not a legal conclusion. This medical opinion will be examined closely as we become more familiar with the materials. Again, to echo what Mike said, we offer our sympathies to the family of Mr. Prude, but the officers involved in this incident did not cause his death. They correctly deployed the segmenting defensive tactic that they received training in. The effects of Mr. Prude's voluntary use of PCP are the root cause of what happened here. Now, on the topic of training and the defensive tactic of segmenting, I turn now to my colleague Daniel Prude, who will provide you with more information on the officers' training and the procedures used on the night of the incident.
Good morning. My name is Daniel Prude. I represent Troy Talladay, who is the officer that you have seen in the videos, who is the officer with the knee on the back of Mr. Prude during the segmenting procedure. Segmenting, as you saw from the video that was shown a few moments ago, is a technique used to gain control of a suspect or an individual who is resisting or is not complying with the orders, the lawful orders of the police officers. The video that you saw is a Department of Criminal Justice Services training video. The officers who were involved in this, and three of them, Officer Talladay, Officer Vaughn, and Officer Santiago, actually had physical contact with Mr. Prude, were all trained in-service training by training officers of the Rochester Police Department in the technique of segmenting. They were trained in January and February of 2020. Additionally, segmenting was part of their training in the police academy. It is a technique that was introduced approximately 3 years ago into the training schedule of the Rochester Police Department. It is utilized and is becoming more widely utilized by departments nationwide and is a very well accepted means of restricting the movements of a non-compliant individual using the least amount of force possible. That is what you will see when you review the videos that you've been provided with in your media packets today. You'll see various angles of what occurred from the body cameras of the police officers who were on scene. In this particular instance, Officers Vaughn and Talladay instituted the segmenting procedure when Mr. Prude, who they had by and large left untouched, although Officer Talladay did touch him once earlier when he was sitting up, trying to control him when Mr. Prude was making a movement toward Officer Talladay, demanding his gun and spitting at him. It was only at that point that they decided that in order to control this individual, that they needed to use what is really a low level of physical restraint. It is designed to not impair airways, to not cause positional asphyxiation, and was executed, when you look at the videos, quite in accordance with the training video that you saw. It's the preferred method of bodily restraint put forth by DCJS. It's used by not only the Rochester Police Department, but also the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, and it was performed to a T by these officers on March 23rd, 2020. Thank you.
Good morning. As you've heard, my name is James Nobles. I represent Officer Mark Vaughn. Just a little bit about Mr. Vaughn that's included in the handout that you have. He is an 8-year veteran of the Rochester Police Department. He was in the Marine Corps and served 2 tours, one in Afghanistan and one in Iraq in the War on Terror. He also was the Officer of the Month in 2019 and has received numerous commendations from the Police Department. What I'm here to really talk to you about today is some of the common misconceptions that we've heard from the media and also in social media. And I'm going to try to address many of your anticipated questions, but we certainly will give you the opportunity to ask more questions after we've finished our presentation. The first of which is about the spit sock. I don't know how many of you have seen a spit sock before, but here is one. It is used every day in hospitals across this country by paramedics, by psychological centers, by jails, by law enforcement, every single day. You can see through it, you can hear through it, you can breathe through it. And I presume that all of you can continue to hear me the same way that you did a moment ago. I can tell you that after being required to wear masks in public for the last several months, that I can breathe better through this than I can through any mask that I've worn to prevent the coronavirus spread. We have some of these available for you to take a look at in further detail if you'd like. One thing about that in particular is we have to remember exactly when this was. On March 23rd, or 23rd rather, Daniel Prude had told the tow truck driver, that he had the coronavirus. That was relayed to the police officers, particularly to my client, Mr. Vaughn, when he interviewed the tow truck driver on the way to Jefferson Avenue. And if we think about this date, it's important for me to remind you that on March 12th, Governor Cuomo had closed all SUNY campuses across the state. And on March 22nd, he issued a stay-at-home order for the entire state of New York and stopped all non-essential businesses. But what we have is we have officers with no personal protective equipment that was issued to them or available to them on March 23rd, dealing with a suspect who is spitting at them, who has already told someone that he has the coronavirus. It is that reason and that reason alone that they go to the spit sock, which again is commonly used daily throughout this country. One of the other, and it's commonly been stated that you can't breathe through this. You absolutely can. It does not impact your breathing in any way, shape, or form, and it is much easier to breathe than one of these Chinese surgical masks that people are wearing all around the country every day. Another common misconception is that these officers should have simply given Mr. Prude a blanket. Well, there's 2 problems with that. One is a practical one. Officers are not issued blankets as part of their RPD equipment. They do not have them in their cars. They are not available to them. Often paramedics do, who arrived in the scene, but they chose as well not to put a blanket on Mr. Prude at any point in time. And the reason is he was not hypo, but hyperthermic as a result of his PCP use. A covering at that point in time would have done far more harm than good. What we know and what the officers knew on the night in question was that Mr. Prude left a house on Child Street in 30-degree weather with no socks, no shoes, no coat. He had continued to voluntarily disrobe throughout his time running through the streets of the city of Rochester over the next half an hour. At some point he takes his shirt off, Ultimately, he takes his pants off, and he's completely naked at the time he is encountered by the police department. The worst thing they could have done was to give him a blanket. He was literally cooking from the inside out. He never mentions being cold. He never shivers. He never requests a blanket or a coat or any kind of covering whatsoever. It's because that's the last thing he wants. This is another example of what's an easy misunderstanding for the public to have about what happened in the night in question, because it is a logical thing, if you don't have the training or the experience or the knowledge, to think, why wouldn't they put a blanket on this guy? But the truth of the matter is it's the worst thing they could have done under the circumstances. They also knew that the ambulance was on its way, and their desire was to get him in the ambulance as quickly as possible. He had already been at Strong Memorial Hospital earlier that day. They knew that he needed to go back, and they knew the ambulance was on the way, and they were headed in that direction. One of the other common questions that accompanies why not give him a blanket was why not put him in the police car? Well, putting him in the police car in terms of a temperature perspective would have done the same thing as a blanket. Remember, he's overheated. He's not cold. In addition to that, putting him in the police car would have required more intervention, more contact, more potential for resisting or disruption or anything along those lines. They would have had to get him to a near standing position, which gives it more of the possibility that he could fall, they could fall, someone could hit their head on the pavement. In addition to that, once the ambulance arrived, they would have had to take him back out of the car to deal with him and put him in the ambulance and the gurney and see that he got on his way to Strong. Again, creating more interaction, and they knew the ambulance was already on the way. In addition to that, although when my client initially takes Mr. Prude into custody, he is seen to be compliant and cooperative, we certainly know that he was anything but well-reasoned and compliant and cooperative for the half an hour before. As we know, he was running through the city streets, disrobing, at least trying to get into one parked, locked car. There's a number of instances that he had contact that were anything but being compliant prior to that. There's also the misconception that the police should have never tried to restrain him, that they should have never gone hands-on. And there's been some contention that he was not in a position to retrieve one of the officer's weapons. And I certainly can understand why the public would believe that. And there's a couple of things that are important to note. Number one is police officers in their 6 months of training and in their on-the-job experience see people in handcuffs obtain weapons from officers or from other locations all the time. What we do know from the video is that Mr. Prude was acting erratically, that at one point he was laying down, at other points he was sitting up. We don't really know what his intention was, but certainly he was moving his legs in a direction to either kick or attempt to stand up. And these officers not only had a reason to protect themselves, they're also charged with protecting Mr. Prude, to prevent him from standing up and then having to take him to the ground or falling down or even from a seated position falling down and hitting his head on the pavement. They're also tasked with having him in a condition that EMS or the paramedics can deal with him when they arrive. They know they're on their way. They didn't just go hands-on with Joe Prude because they wanted to, because they thought he was being disrespectful or they wanted to have some sort of intervention that night. That's the last thing they wanted to do. Put yourself in that position. You've got someone who you know is high on PCP. You've got someone who has been released from the hospital earlier that day and now needs to go back. You've got someone who was suicidal earlier in the day based on his own family's information. You've got someone who, for the last half an hour, has been running around the streets of Rochester in 30-degree weather disrobing. You've got someone who tries to break into a car, who did break into a store, who confronted a tow truck driver. You've also got the video of Mr. Prude's interaction with an individual who on Facebook goes by Frederico Kruger, which is on your zip drive. You've got his interactions in those instances. This person, at the time that the police officers came in contact with him, was unfortunately very high on PCP. He was unfortunately covered in blood. In the Frederico Kruger video, you can see that Mr. Prude actually stops at one point and appears to defecate in the street. When the officers come in contact with him, he also has feces on his body. He also has told the tow truck driver that he has the coronavirus. He has also been spitting at the police officers. He's been asking for their guns so he can shoot himself or shoot them. They're not in a position where they can just leave him alone when he starts to react. Believe me when I tell you, the last thing we wanted to do, given all those facts and circumstances that I've just outlined, was go hands-on with this individual. But they didn't really have a choice. Do you think he was going to be cooperative with the EMS people when they arrived and say, oh no, I'm going to lay still now and you can do what you need to do? They needed to get him under control so he could be sedated, as you hear the EMT talk about in the video, or at least transferred to the gurney and secured so that they could give him the medical treatment that he needed. Ultimately, there's no question that it's a tragic situation for Mr. Prude's family, and we're not here to say anything different than that. And there may need to be conversations about training and conversation about who responds to a mental health intervention. But under the facts and circumstances as they've been provided in this case, these officers did exactly what they were trained to do, and they did it flawlessly. It is unfortunate and it is a tragedy that Mr. Prude passed away, but it's not, as best we can tell, in any relationship to the actions that the officers took on the night in question. It's easy from a layperson's perspective to sit back and judge what happened on that night. But if you lived in that neighborhood, or if you were a police officer on the street that night in 30 degrees with a suspect high on PCP who'd been running around the streets, acting erratically, sometimes violently, you have to deal with that situation. And when you don't know what to do, you have to rely on your training, and you have to implement and execute your training. That's exactly what happened here, and that's why these officers deserve to be reinstated. That's why these officers have not been charged with a crime. That's why these officers have been suspended unfairly. And the reality of the situation is we've got more time and opportunity to continue to do our own investigation in this case, which is what we're going to continue to do, and bring forth more facts that are going to clear them. We are absolutely willing to take your questions. I don't know that I will be the one to answer them, but depending on your particular area of inquiry, myself or one of my colleagues will answer your questions.
James, you said putting the blanket on him would have been the worst thing they could have done. Isn't the worst thing they could have done was not pay attention to the fact that he stopped breathing?
Well, I don't want to get into the facts and circumstances specifically of what people did or didn't know, but they were paying attention. They were monitoring what happened. And if you watch the video, right before my client asks him if he's okay, you see 3 breaths, and then it stops. My client notices that. That's when they roll him over. The officers...
That's not what I recall seeing in the video.
Well, you may need to review it again.
I recall seeing in the video that there was no movement from him, that he had vomited at some point. And then they start tapping him and saying, hey, buddy, are you okay?
Yes. Go back and watch the video and watch for, and I'm not sure which body-worn camera it is on, but on one of them there are 3 breaths right before his inquiry of, are you okay?
Have you watched the full video?
I've watched all 88 minutes of body-worn camera video that's available.
Comment on several of the things that we all have seen in the video, including the fact that, and you also mentioned some medical information that did not come from the medical examiner's report that you said you have not seen all of. So where are you basing your medical diagnosis from? Are they medical experts?
In which diagnosis? Are you talking about our description of PCP or the...
His cause of death and cause of death.
Again, as we've mentioned, when you read a medical examiner's report and they list the cause of death, that is a matter of medical opinion. That is not a legal conclusion. So when you see in a medical examiner's report that the manner of death is homicide, that doesn't mean legally that that equates to murder.
So whose medical opinion are you taking in what you've just given to the press today? Whose medical opinion? Are you all medical professionals as well?
As I mentioned, we're going to continue to review the medical examiner's report, consult with our own experts.
So the information that you just provided that was medical opinion is coming from you and your opinion, not from medical experts. So you just provided that to the public and to the media.
We're providing a legal conclusion based on the available evidence we have.
Using medical opinion.
Based on the evidence we have. Again, we don't have the full final medical examiner's report. We haven't had the opportunity to completely dissect it. We have not had the opportunity to have other experts take a look at it. But if you take a look at what happened here and you review what it is
That's probably it then. That probably means we probably shouldn't use any of that.
Well, ma'am, I'd like to answer your question if I can complete my...
You answered it.
Okay.
Hey, James, let me ask you a question here. Is doing what they were trained to do. James, is,
I'm sorry, Berkeley, could you wait a minute? I can't hear you.
Yeah, please don't put your hands on her. Okay.
James, when,
I'm asking questions.
James, when you say that the officers were doing what they were trained to do,
Yes.
is that akin to somebody saying I was just following orders?
No. The training is different than following orders. Following orders is your supervisor telling you what to do. Following your training is you've been trained to use this technique and implement these things in these situations, and that's what they were doing. So training is different than following orders. I don't know if that answers your question, Berkeley.
I guess when I talk to my neighbors,
Sure.
one of the things that bothers them, and they're laypersons just like myself when it comes to law enforcement,
Sure.
they're wondering where was the humanity and where was the compassion after 3 a.m. on the morning of March 23rd?
And what do you mean by that, Berkeley? Do you mean that they should have given him a blanket or they should have put him in the police car? What is specifically your question, if I can drill down on that a little further?
Yeah, sure. Why at the time didn't they look to at least try to care for him, a man who was struggling on the ground?
So, Berkeley, I think I've answered the questions about both the blanket as well as putting him in the police car. The humane thing to do was to get him to the people who could give him the medical treatment he needed, and they were trying to do that in the most expeditious manner they could.
And just to
go
go
ahead.
ahead too, Berkeley, if you, like I mentioned before, at 3:16, these officers are there. You see them circling Mr. Prude, and what happens at 3:17? They call for emergency services. It's not like they're sitting there waiting to see what to do. They knew this person was in trouble. They knew he was on PCP. They knew he was having an issue. They called for emergency services right away, and that's what they did. And you see them circling around to say, okay, they know based on their training they really can't approach him. He's hypothermic, I'm sorry. And they didn't want to touch him at that point because of that fact. He had this COVID-19. He was saying he's got coronavirus. He's spitting on them. He's covered with blood and feces. They have to protect themselves and protect him. By circling him, not letting him move at that point, they did what they were trained to do. That's part of their training. And then what they do, they called EMS right away, which is what they had to do.
It appeared that he wasn't really struggling, that the first initial, when he started to get up, one of them had touched him on the shoulder and he sat down. He was compliant when he was put in handcuffs. There was a lot of compliance and it seemed like it was overkill.
Well, at first, of course, you see that, but you don't hear exactly what he's saying. He's making these threats for the gun. He's reaching. He's doing things that were not as he was commanded to do, unfortunately. These officers did their best to keep hands off. If you look at the video, they had hands on him for only 2 minutes at the time, all right? They tried to leave him alone. They called services. EMS was there within 4 minutes, okay? And they did everything they could not to put hands on him at that point because they knew what they were dealing with.
But like the overall, looking at the video, looking at the edited, looking at the unedited, he was irrational. He was not being violent. He was being compliant in a lot of ways. It just seemed like they could have just kept saying, you got to stay seated.
As they were
just going right to it.
Tina, at some point, they needed to get this man onto the gurney. And as James had mentioned, there was never going to come a point here where he was simply going to say, okay, I'll voluntarily go sit on the gurney and you can take me back to the hospital. The officers had to make a decision. And it's very easy to sit here and second guess that, some 6, 8 months later with the benefit of hindsight. It was never going to end in a voluntary situation where this man was going to go to the help he needed. Now, you look at this training video we watched, and there's a couple things I'll say about that. Number one, it's meant to be conducted in a way that does not restrict the subject's airway. At no point do you ever see hands on this man's neck, hands on his mouth, hands over his nose. That's number one. Number two, Officer Talladay's knee was to restrict the lower part of his back, his hips. It's not up in his upper back where his lungs are. All right? So the purpose of the new segmenting technique is to prevent some of the scenes we've seen nationwide where officers are forced to use strikes, kicks, punches, some of their weapons to subdue suspects. It's also meant to make sure that that officers don't have to go in as a pile or a large group to restrain a suspect. This is meant to make sure that everybody leaves the encounter uninjured. What is the X factor in this particular situation? The X factor in this particular situation is all of the effects that this man's voluntary ingestion of PCP and the acute intoxicating effects had. I've talked about some of those effects. Among them, respiratory impairment, among them overheating and increased metabolism, increased blood pressure, increased heart rate. We don't have all the medical evidence yet. We haven't been provided with it. We haven't had a chance to deal with it. But what I can tell you is, in looking at the medical examiner's report, this man was not choked. He was not suffocated. So therefore, in reviewing what was done with the training, in reviewing what happened out there, knowing that the segmenting technique and its intended purposes were performed correctly, the result of this man's death, or how it resulted, had nothing to do with anything any of our clients did or did not do that night.
If there was a
How did you guys get information
on the scene that day, if there was a mental health professional on the scene that morning, would the outcome have been different?
No, because mental health professionals are meant to come in after the scenario plays out. It would not have been a mental health professional that somehow would have talked this man into the ambulance, Berkeley. That's just pure fantasy.
If the point was to restrain him until the ambulance arrived, why was he still being restrained while the ambulance was there?
There was never going to come a time where this man voluntarily said, I'm going to simply go sit on the gurney and you can take me away. Because he never exhibits that behavior at any point.
Yes, sir. He puts his hands behind his back when asked by the officers. He said,
That's
yes,
certainly
sir,
one
many
interpretation.
times.
That's not what we
Can I
saw.
ask you a question?
Sure.
There was a point in the video where there was a lot of force being on the back of his head. Then when you can feel people, the back of his head and his upper abdomen, whether you want to admit that or not here. You can see that, and then when you're putting your force on someone, your body weight on someone, you can feel when their breath stops resisting your push. There was a point in time where we visibly saw his breath stop resisting this officer's push, and then suddenly that force that they felt was so needed while he was handcuffed and laying on the ground was no longer needed. They released themselves and they started, swearing and things of that nature. They started being very, very concerned because they knew if this man was no longer with us. Why was that force no longer needed after resistance? Why was it needed while he was handcuffed?
That's a great question, and the reality is what body cameras don't show is someone trying to get up. If I'm laying on the ground right now and Mike's got his hands on my head, he knows whether I'm trying to stand up or not, based on what he feels in my neck, based on what he feels in my back, based on what he feels in my muscle contractions and things happening. It's our understanding that Mr. Prude was continuing to resist and try to push up and try to get up until the moment that you just described. And when that moment takes place, you and I may disagree about this, and that's okay, but the reality is neither you nor I were there hands-on and felt whether there was resistance or whether there wasn't. It's our understanding that there was, and certainly as soon as it releases, as you point out, all of the officers go hands off and roll him over.
The resistance was only coming from him breathing. And when that breathing resistance was no longer, that's when they decided to stop.
I'm sorry, but I don't know that you can know that without having been at the scene.
Saw the video. Did anybody
Yes.
else see that? Does anyone else want to chime in? That's correct.
But the video does not show the resistance that is felt in people's hands and in their body. As you pointed out, you yourself, when asking that question, said to
He was not trying
me,
to get up at that point, is what I'm telling you.
I don't think any of us can know that from watching the video. I think you can only know that from having been on.
Will, you had a question?
Yeah. How did you guys get access to information about Mr. Prude's alleged drug use in the time between his discharge from Strong and then his contact with cops? Between that 4-hour window. Is that just a supposition at this point, or are you guys basing that on some?
Well, Will, you know that there's medical information about his initial stay at Strong in the evening of the 22nd that's been put out there in the public, whether that's right or wrong. And there were conclusions made in that medical information that he was not suffering from any acute psychosis or acute intoxication at the time he left the hospital. What we do know is when they draw his blood at 4 a.m. after he's brought to Strong, that shows the presence of PCP and other substances in his system. So it's not a great leap of logic to conclude that he used PCP between those two times. And then the other thing I'd point you to, you take a look at what his brother, Joseph Prude, who again, our sympathies go out to the Prude family for what happened here. But Joseph, in the two encounters he has with Officer Speckscore, essentially is throwing his hands up. He describes a man who's a long-term user of this substance. He describes a man who's out of control. In the video at 4 a.m. when Speckscore goes to see him, he expresses, basically that this is what he expected to have happen based on the way he had been acting that night and the things he had been using. So these are the conclusions we're led to draw from the evidence we have in this case.
What's the role of HIPAA in slowing or whatever, not getting all of his medical records from Strong? Do you have a way, get around HIPAA, or is that stopping you?
Sure. I mean, the way you do that is through subpoenas, but nobody's been charged with anything yet. Okay, so we don't have a judge to go to make an application to say we'd like to have access to all of the medical records, all of the medical examiner's records. We have what we have, and we're able to take a look at what we have, and we can offer information based on that.
So if there are charges, then you have the option of getting those records released?
That's how it's done.
What about the fact that the cops couldn't find the key for the handcuffs while Mr. Prude was restrained and while EMTs were at the scene? Does that raise any red flags to you? I mean, that seems, and it also seems like, for a follow-up question, it seems like there was a lack of empathy from the officers too. It seems like in some instances they were almost making fun of Mr. Prude.
As far as the handcuff key goes, I think if you look at the video carefully, that the handcuff key was in Officer Talladay's possession long before the EMTs authorized him to take the handcuffs off. As far as the lack of empathy, these individuals, these police officers, were simply doing their job in a very stressful situation.
Can you speak to the 911 call? You mentioned Joe Prude, and you mentioned that Joe Prude has thrown his hands up of his brother, which is not what we have heard from Joe Prude himself. In the 911 call, he actually explicitly said, and when he interacted with the police, "Do not kill my brother. He is not a danger to anyone but himself." Can you speak to that?
I'd point you to what's going to be provided in the press packets. His much more lengthy and detailed statements to Officer Spec score are not necessarily consistent with that.
Back to the medical examiner's report, it also mentions a cause of death as complications of asphyxia due to the setting of physical restraint, as well as PCP. So I'm wondering why you're only mentioning the PCP.
Well, we're wondering why that is being mentioned as the primary cause of death, and we're certainly going to have our own medical professionals take a look at that. But what I would mention in terms of positional asphyxia, what we do know is that people may die from positional asphyxia on an accidental basis, but this happens most often when the mouth and the nose are blocked or where the chest may be unable to fully expand. At no point in this video, when you watch it, is his nose or mouth blocked, nor is Officer Talladay's knee positioned in a way which would not allow his chest to expand. So we're as curious about that as you are. Again, based on what we've seen, the conclusion, the preliminary conclusion we can draw at this point is that the X factor here are the effects of PCP and how it may have caused his body to react and how it may have led to the serious complications that ultimately led to his demise.
And I just want to follow up on that last question, because what the summary report of the medical examiner says is complications of asphyxia in the setting of physical restraint, not due to physical restraint.
You said the medical examiner's report is opinion. Is that not a legal document? The medical examiner's report, is that not a legal document set forth by the state or the governance of the state?
So there's been many examples over the years where a medical examiner's report will say the manner of death is homicide. That, again, is a medical opinion. For example, where there is a situation where an officer draws his weapon and justified in doing so, it will say that the cause of death is homicide. But that is a medical opinion, okay? Because it says homicide doesn't necessarily mean that that medical opinion equates to a legal conclusion, being that this is a murder or a manslaughter or something along those lines as homicide is defined in our penal law.
Is it a legal document or is it opinion?
It is a medical opinion contained in a document that is often submitted for purposes of deciding whether something has happened legally.
We've just received word that they're trying to arrest a member of the public for trying to come to this press conference. Is there a reason that the public is not allowed to actually hear this? You are addressing the public at this point. Right now they're trying to arrest someone outside, and I would encourage all the press to go and document that. Because again, this is harassment, and all we want is justice for Daniel Prude in our community in Rochester. I'm not sure if y'all are from this community, but that's what people want. So,
what, can you answer that, and then I'll kind of a follow-up?
I'm not sure that was a question, it's more of a statement, but go ahead.
I did ask a question. Is there a reason why that's happening?
Man, we've been in here with you the whole time. So we don't know.
Okay.
So there's been a talk since September 2nd of justice for Daniel Prude.
Yes.
What does that word mean to you as representing the officers that people want to have justice brought on? What, is it synonymous with punishment, revenge, or what does justice mean to the attorneys here?
I think justice means any changes that need to take place in the training or the system that would potentially prevent something like this from happening again. I'm not sure that this could be prevented, and if in fact his death was caused by PCP, it may have taken place irrespective of whether there was any contact with law enforcement that night. But justice in the system, and I think what is important, you know, all of us here are criminal defense attorneys. We have far more often represented people charged with a crime by the police than we have the police. We have far more often represented people from minority groups, including Hispanic and black and transgender and a variety of different walks of life and economic backgrounds. And the reality is we do see systemic racism in the system. But it's not necessarily what happened on this particular night in question. Some of it is at the prosecution level. Some of it is at the charging decision level. Some of it is in the decisions to stop certain vehicles and not others. There is issues that need to be dealt with in this system, and we are sensitive to that. And for me, your question is really an opinion question. And my opinion is justice for Daniel Prude is that we change the system in a way that it's fair to everybody. That would be my answer to you.
When you say system, do you include the training in that? The police
absolutely.
That also
if the training needs to be addressed and needs to be changed, then that should absolutely be addressed and changed.
And it should be mentioned about that training, the segmenting technique is not something that RPD came up with on their own. This was something that the Division of Criminal Justice Services, since 2017, has been seeking to roll out statewide. You have to understand what the role of DCJS is. DCJS is essentially the agency, the state agency, that is responsible for the proper training and procedures of law enforcement. So we've talked about some of the other agencies that use this technique. We're aware that it's used in places like Kingston and Schenectady and Utica and places around the state. But I'd also mention at this point, as we stand here today on October 1st, segmenting is still the preferred lowest level use of force, still the order of the day for our officers with RPD, with the sheriffs, and with every other agency that has employed it. Nobody has done anything at this point to eliminate it or to outlaw it in terms of the preferred method to be used. So again, it is implemented for certain reasons. It's for safety of the officers, it's for safety of the suspects. If there's to be a review of this, we encourage that, but our officers involved here fell back on their training when the situation became critical. And from everything we've been able to glean so far, they executed their training exactly as it had been administered to them.
Two questions for you.
Yes, Will.
Have your clients yet communicated with the State Attorney General's office? Have there been any sit-downs with the State Attorney General's office at this point?
Not as of yet, no.
And also, you say that you don't have all the information right now. So why are you presenting what you're showing then is incomplete information? Why are you presenting that to the public if you guys don't have all the information you'd like?
If I could take both. Sure. Number one, nobody has complete information right now, which is why everyone's doing their own investigation. The AG's office, City Council, other agencies. Everyone's doing their own investigation because no one has all the information. That's what we're doing here. And in terms of whether or not our clients are complying with the Attorney General's office or working with them, we are in discussions about making that happen right now. So that is something that we're addressing and we're dealing with and we're moving towards.
Do you think that all these investigations that are happening at some point could be counterproductive? So if they start to find different things, where is truth with even a medium-sized team, let alone a capital?
Sure. I mean, certainly that's an issue. All we can do is do our own investigation. We owe it to our clients to do that investigation. We owe it to our clients to be prepared for any eventuality that may come here. And the reality is I can't control who else is doing an investigation or not doing an investigation. I'm not going to tell you who I think should be doing the investigation or who shouldn't be doing the investigation. But we owe it to our clients to do our own. We have uncovered some things in some ways that we believe they've been treated unfairly, and that's why we come here today. Not because we're done working on this case, but because a lot of time has passed and no one has spoken out for these 7 individuals, and that's what we're here to do. We are very much going to continue what we're doing. We will, again, I'm sure, take the opportunity to address the media, put out press releases, speak with you individually or corporately, whatever the case might be, as we continue to learn more, which I'm certain we will do.
Are the officers cooperating with the Attorney General's investigation? Have they been interviewed yet?
That's the question that we just dealt with Will. We're working on that as we speak. We've all been in communications with the Attorney General's offices. Everyone needs to, as you know, I only represent one officer. Everyone's got to make their own decisions about what they are or aren't doing in that regard. But I can tell you I've had several conversations with the AG's office about getting to that very quickly.
Are your clients sorry for anything they did or did not do?
I think anytime someone is involved where someone expires, of course there's remorse. Of course they're upset. Does that mean that they did something wrong? I think that's a different question. But do I know that my client feels remorse for the Prude family? Absolutely he does. Not because he believes he did anything wrong, but because this unfortunate incident took place.
Does anybody feel remorse that Paul Ricotta's name's been dragged through the mud and he was several blocks over and he wasn't even there? Does anybody feel remorse for Andrew Spegscore, who, as you're going to see in those videos, was a complete and absolute professional with Joseph Prude in both of those encounters? He was in his squad car at the time the use of force was implemented here. None of the other officers did anything wrong according to their training. Please don't make that mistake when I make these remarks, Berkeley. But again, these two men who want nothing more than to go back to serving their community are now in limbo for a situation where they weren't even present. How is that fair? How is that just?
Are you comparing that to a man's death right now?
Not at all. Again, we continue to express profound sorrow and respect for what the family is going through here. Okay. However,
they were not in the car. They were there and they were complicit. They didn't say anything.
ma'am, Andrew Spegscore was in his patrol car at the time this happened. Paul Ricotta was on West Main Street. He wasn't even there.
So
and I'll go further and tell you.
Radio coming on the
No, no, ma'am. They were not present.
Any of the officers standing around, let me say that, let me be
Sure.
specific, were complicit because they were standing around, they were making jokes about him being naked and taking his temperature through his butt, sodomizing him. They were laughing. They were using a lot of force on him. He ended up not breathing. The people who were there, whether they were using the force or not, were complicit in that, and as well as the EMT.
I can tell you from communicating with my clients that were present, the two officers who were present, who were my clients, have indicated to me that had they seen anything that was out of order, anything that was at cross purposes with the procedures they were to use and the training they were given, they would have interceded and they would have stopped this. This was done by the book. The unfortunate result is that, unfortunately, Mr. Prude has passed away. Everybody feels bad about that, but that is, again, not due to anything any of our clients did or did not do on March 22nd or 23rd.
Does the training include, like, sometimes when you have training, it just shows you how to do it. But did it include, like, what is it like if someone struggles or someone shifts?
Tina, we've provided you with literally the Bible of how DCJS wants this technique performed. What you watched earlier was basically a short summary.
There's actually a manual that we've given to you in a zip drive that you'll see the actual 14 or 15-page manual that explains all the potential situations that these officers have to encounter or do encounter with. So,
And so they read the manual, or do they practice?
they have to be proficient in the manual. So they're tested on the manual. And they were all tested in January of 2020 and all passed the proficiency test.
Like CPR, you're
Correct.
told, okay, 32, but there's nothing like doing hands-on so you know what it actually feels like.
Again, Tina, they have to be, they're tested, they're trained, and they have to pass the proficiency exam in this training, which they all did. So is it like CPA? It's very similar to CPR, yes.
And it's under all different conditions, calm and
Correct.
not so calm.
And they were all hands-on tested, hands-on performed, hands-on tested, and all performed. It's only the grade is acceptable or not acceptable, and they were all acceptable in their testing at the conclusion of their training.
At this point, we are
We'll take any questions individually, too, if you want to talk to us.
we will certainly make ourselves available to any members of the media who have other specific questions, but we only allotted an hour for today's presentation, and we're certainly happy to continue to interface with you as time goes along.
I encourage all press to actually come in and cover this part of the story as well, since it appears to be now a part of that story, since they have ordered the arrest.
Even if people rock is outside, they're trying to
Well,
arrest them.
Thank everybody for coming today. Again, we'll be available individually if you like, if there's anything else we can answer. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah.
I'm still unclear.
How are you?
I'm going to use
So, in other words, good, man, how are you?
mannequins.
Thank you. I don't think I know you. How are you?
They all have to be.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Wait, James seems to